Today, today's topic is sacred names, understanding the power and use of names in ancient scripture, modern revelation, and in sacred spaces. And the goal of what I'm trying to share with you is just about 10 years of research in the way names are used, both biblically and historically, and then hopefully it opens up an entire door that will gain greater understanding of the Book of Mormon through. So the outcome is to lay a little bit of a foundation, teach a couple key principles that suddenly we can apply and see a whole new context to the Book of Mormon and how that works as a source of ancient scripture. So there's going to be a few things, and I'm going to get really specific, and then I'm going to be really repetitive on just like a few key rules. Because if you understand a few key rules, things just open up when we talk about names and the function of names. And then we'll go through some examples in the Book of Mormon. And ideally, this is like fun and exciting for you. Now, I'm going to try to avoid like a whole bunch of references, but if you want the references, they're in this book. It's on Amazon. It's called Sacred Names. And but my goal, so I wrote it, but my goal is to not have to have you spend money. You can just be like, oh, I heard it in this hour, and I'm good, and we can just move on, right? Okay, so to understand the use of names in the scriptures, you have to understand a few things about the use of names in ancient times. If you understand the way names were used in ancient times, and then we see examples of them in the Bible, then you can apply those same principles into the Book of Mormon, and suddenly you have almost an entirely different narrative that can pop up periodically. Anciently, names were used in this context. To understand or to evoke someone's name indicated that you have claim, dominion, or authority over that person or on that person. To know someone's name meant you had claim, dominion, or authority. Now, most appropriate translation for the word dominion is responsibility for. To have dominion over something means you're responsible for something. Not that you have dominion or oppressive nature with them, it's that you're responsible for them. So when Adam is given dominion over the fish of the sea, over the beasts of the field, he's responsible for them. And the way he's empowered to be responsible is he names them. By naming them, it's a direct reference to him having dominion over them. He knows their name. He's named them, he's called them. And so, now, throughout your life anciently, your name evolves. Your name doesn't evolve and your name doesn't change. Your names evolve. Throughout your life, anciently, as you grow and you gain new traits, new characteristics, new behaviors, or you make new contracts, covenants, or agreements, you receive new names. And each one of these names represent a portion of your life. Now, we have some really diluted framework for that today. People go to medical school, and then afterwards they receive the name doctor. And when I refer to my neighbor, so previously my neighbor was my physician, or my pediatrician for my children, my bishop, my neighbor, and my friend. And when I went to him and I said, Dr. Spencer, it evoked a part of his life, that part. I was claiming on him to be a doctor. And then when I go bishop, I'm asking for spiritual guidance. And then when I say Weston, come help me fix my fence, right? I'm asking him as a neighbor and a friend. Now, that concept is really dilutive today, but in ancient life, that was the only way you lived your life. That was it. When you were given a name, you had a family name, and that meant if I evoke that name, I'm calling upon you in a familiar relationship. And then as I grew and I gained a trade, I would get a public name, and the community would know me by this name. And if I heard Phil in public, I knew that meant in that context, I was being called upon as that role. And then before contracts were really well established on paper and carried around, your contract had a name to it. And so independent of religious covenants, you would make a contractual covenant, right? Covenants aren't only religious, they're also social at that phase. You would make a covenant, you would split the animal in half, you would walk back and forth between the animal, you'd say something like, so if I violate this covenant, this happened to me, I get split in half, slot of thunder, whatever. And then we would make a name for the covenant. And it would be a name that only me and the person making the covenant knew. And I would take that name upon me, and you would take that name upon you. Now I have a name that no one else knows, and it's associated with this contract and this agreement. Later in life, if someone comes to me and evokes that name that only I know and only you know, it indicates to me that they have claim on that covenant, on that contract. And I am to pay them accordingly, or behave and respond. They are having claim on me according to that name. So that's key. That is foundational for when we get into the scriptures and we say, as we move into the Book of Mormon here in a minute, to know a person's name gives you claim on that part of their identity, not the whole, right? It doesn't mean me calling them doctor. It means I suddenly call upon them in every aspect of their life, just on that portion that that name represents. This becomes pretty critical as we go through the rest of the Bible. Big principle, really important. There's a quote here, I'm just going to read it, and I have it on here so I can remember it because it's a big one. William Propp is the author of the Anchored Bible series on the book of Exodus. And he says, as he goes through this narration of Moses getting the name of God before he goes and visits Israel, the burning bush, who shall I say sends me? Right? Why is he asking that question? He's asking that question because he's trying to get the name that's going to give him claim or authority. It's a powerful moment for the Israelites when Moses is given I am that I am, or Jehovah, or Yahweh. He's given the name of God. It denotes to Israel he now has claim, power, and authority on Jehovah. It is a powerful moment, right, for them. And so in his commentary, he says, why such a fascination with deities' names? The noun Shem can also mean self or essence, and scholars often observe that to know an object's name in the world of magic is to possess the power of it. But what about a deity's name? In ancient Egypt, knowing the god's secret name gave humans a degree of mastery over them. Similarly, in later magical folklore, both Jewish and Gentile, God possesses a secret name, not Yahweh, the knowledge of which confers some of his power upon humans. It is supposedly engraven, for example, on Moses' staff. Humans in the Bible then are understandably hesitant of disclosing them and very aggressive at trying to learn them. Okay? So, example in the book of Genesis, right? Jacob, he's going to get a new name, Israel. And that experience is fascinating. Because you're in chapter 32 of Genesis, and Jacob is returning to his homeland. And if you remember, when he left Esau, they did not leave on great terms, right? Jacob actually kind of fled in this whole, I just took Esau's birthright, and just took his blessing, and he's going to come after me. And so in an effort to come back, he is so terrified of this experience, he starts sending, if you remember, hordes. In fact, they make a point of saying, he's actually sending everything he took first and giving it to him and saying, I hope I can just temper him. And then he eventually sends his family because he's not going to kill all these women and children, right? And he just kind of sends them over. And he is alone on the other side of the river. And there, Jacob's left alone, right? In 32:24, Jacob's left alone, and there wrestled with a man until the break of day. Wrestle, more effectively, is translated efficiently as embraces, right? And he wrestles with him, and the angel says, let me go, for the day breaketh. Right? The angel's like, I got to go. And he says, I will not except thou bless me. And he said unto him, and now the angel says to him, this is an interesting interplay. He says, what is your name? To Jacob. And Jacob does something. He says, my name's Jacob. So immediately, Jacob is empowering the angel and submitting to him. He's giving him his familiar name, and he's giving him authority to call upon him. So he's actually submitting. It's not just this idea of, I'm wrestling, I got him pinned, and now you gotta do something for me. He's like, I got you pinned. He's like, let me go. And he's like, until you bless me. And he goes, what's your name? And so what the angel's asking for is, you're going to tell me something kind of sacred about yourself. And he goes, Jacob. And the angel says, and he said, but this gentleman, this angel says, thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel. For as a prince thou hast power with God and with man, and hast prevailed. Now, a cleaner translation, and even within our own commentary, it's not thy name shall no more be Jacob. It's thy name shall no longer only be Jacob. Right? He's not removing Jacob, he's adding to it. And he's giving him a covenant name of Israel. And with the name Israel comes a covenant. Right? So he's giving a covenant name. And then Jacob does something pretty ballsy. And that probably will get challenged in the video at some point. But Jacob then asks the angel and says, tell me your name. Because Jacob knows, if I can get your name, then I can call upon you all the time. I can have claim on you. So he says, tell me your name, I pray thee. And the angel said, wherefore is that thou dost ask after my name? He's like, you don't want my name. My name isn't what you want. You want something else. And then we kind of go dark. And then Jacob walks away and he calls the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face. So the angel says, you don't want my name. You want something else. And then the next thing we find out is he names it after Peniel, where he named that because he has seen God face to face. So the angel in essence is like, you don't want my name. You want to meet God. Right? So this idea of calling upon the name of God and having the name is pretty powerful. And that's where we develop ourselves into the creation of the salvation of Israel, and that important moment when Moses is like, who shall I say sent me? What he's actually asking for is, what name are you going to empower me with? So that when I go, I'm empowered to evoke a name. And he's given Jehovah or Yahweh. So Yahweh, it's interesting. I'll actually go through this narrative in a minute, but Jehovah is kind of the Anglicized version of what we believe is Yahweh. In the scriptures, we have a couple types of names that we see. So remember, not all names are created equal. That's important to note, right? We have given names, and those are names given from parents to children. And in reality, most of what we have in the scriptures, given names are extremely rare. And the only time you see them is when it actually says, and his mother called him Samuel. Samuel is actually one of the clearest examples of a given name. Everything else kind of is a little fuzzy on what the given name is, right? And there's a lot of clarity in the scriptures. They're actually trying to say that, like, this is actually his given name, and they get very clear. And his mother called him Samuel. Very clear. Samuel's a given name, and it's important that we know that it is. There's earned, named, or assigned names. Names that you qualify for. Names that you receive because that's who you are, right? There becomes covenant names where you develop a covenant relationship and your name changes. So, for instance, Simon Bar-Jonah, the Lord's like, hey, I'm going to call you Peter because you're the rock. Right? And Peter means rock. Peter is not his given name. His given name is Simon. Simon, son of Jonah. Given name. He's going to get a new name. It's going to represent a part of his life as the leader of the church. It's going to be Peter. If I'm walking down the street and I'm like, hey, Peter, I'm evoking him as an apostle. If I'm like, hey, Simon, he's my neighbor. right? And I have different calls upon them. Then there's title names. Title names are going to come by authority. This is when a king is coronated and takes a new name upon him. This still happens in the Catholic Church as popes are coronated. When popes get into place, they take a new name upon them and it becomes a title name. And we have examples of title names in the Book of Mormon, interestingly enough. So title names, when we get into Jacob, Nephi passes, and Jacob makes a really interesting play here where he talks about, he says, the people having loved Nephi exceedingly, and having been a great protector for them, having wielded the sword of Laban in their defense, and having labored all his days. Wherefore the people were desirous to retain in remembrance his name. And whoso should reign in his stead were called the people of Nephi. 2nd Nephi, 3rd Nephi, 4th Nephi, according to the reign of the kings. So then Nephi becomes a title name. When you become the king, you're going to take upon yourself the name Nephi. Nephi, when I call upon you as King Nephi, I'm calling upon you as a king. Right? Interestingly enough, it explains why they're called Nephites. He says later, he says, and it came to pass that Nephi died. Now the people which were not Lamanites were Nephites. Nevertheless, they were Nephites, Jacobites, Josephites, Zoramites, Lamanites, Lemuelites, Ishmaelites. A whole bunch of tribes, but they're all led by a Nephite. A Nephi, so they're the people of Nephi. So they're Nephites. Nephites become a political title, not a religious one. That also changes a little bit of the narrative as you go forward. And then you have descriptive names. Names that people earn because they're descriptive of them. Like as you go through the Old Testament, you get like, oh, it's really neat that Elijah, like his parents were so forethought that they called him Elijah. Jehovah is my salvation. It's so neat that they, Job, sorrow. Man, that sucks to call him Job. Like, did you know that he was going to be sad his whole life? That kind of sucks. Right? It's not that those were their given names, it's that those were names. Elijah may or may not be a covenant name, but those were their prophetic names. And those were names that later would be given to them as descriptors. Right? And so we have this really interesting correlation between these changes in names. Okay. So here's where it gets a little interesting, and I just wanted to lay that foundation, because what that does, we're going to come back around to that. That opens up the Book of Mormon in some pretty interesting ways. One of the most powerful things to understand is related to the name of God in the Bible, and how that ends up translating over to the translation process of the Book of Mormon and its possible implications. So, traditionally, as a consequence of this, the Israelites and eventually the Jews felt really uncomfortable with this idea. The idea that to know the name of God would denote, or to use it would denote you have some claim, power, and authority. And so there became a lot of theological discussions a couple centuries BC that continued on all the way a couple centuries after Christ into the Common Era, where the discussion was, can we actually have claim, authority, or dominion on God, and how could a human do that? And so the most common real interpretation of thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain is not don't swear, it's that don't call upon him for nothing, right? Don't evoke him, don't have claim on him, don't pretend dominion over him for nothing. And so what they did was, in the couple centuries BC, they started to build a hedge around it. And so within their text, within their scrolls, as they read the law in public, they would read JHVH, which is the name Jehovah or the name Yahweh. When they came across that, they would replace it verbally with Adonai, which means Lord. So in order to not violate and take upon the name of the Lord, or presume they could have claim or dominion over God, they would replace it verbally when they read. And eventually, as they started to make copies and send them out to synagogues, The fear was that it didn't have any control over it. How can we ensure that as they read the script aloud, they replaced those words, those letters with that word? And so they started to actually physically replace JHVH in Hebrew with Adonai to ensure that when it was read aloud, they would use Adonai rather than Yahweh or Jehovah. What this means is it didn't take more than a century of this before we actually lost the pronunciation of the word. We assume it's Yahweh, like that's like the closest way we can read that in Hebrew, but we don't actually know because it's been 2 centuries since anyone actually heard it. We just assume we know how to conjugate it. So it's just really interesting how that gets lost. So when we flash forward into the King James translation, this will be critical because the Book of Mormon uses the King James rules in the process. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But the King James translators, as they were translating it, were seeking for as much academic accuracy as possible. And they came up to this word, JHBH, in the text. And they didn't know what to do with that. Because they wanted it to be accurate, but they also wanted to be sensitive. So what they chose to do was they chose to replace JHVH, Jehovah, in the text with the words, the Lord. But they also wanted to be accurate, so they wanted to designate to the reader that it was a substitute. So what they did was they replaced the JHVH with the Lord, and in order to designate to the reader that it was a substitute, they capitalized the word Lord and put ORD in smaller capital letters. So when you read in your Old Testament and you see the Lord, you'll notice LORD are capitalized every single time. And that's to designate to the reader, hey, this is a substitution for that, and we're just keeping the tradition of substitution in play. That's kind of important. Now, most readers don't know or recognize that at all. They don't care. In fact, by the time you get to 1830, unless you're in like a divinity school, you also don't know. You're just reading the Bible and you see the Lord and you're like, awesome, the Lord, the Lord, the Lord. This is great. Now, when we get to the Book of Mormon, the translation process in the Book of Mormon, understanding what they were doing in the translation process is important because the Book of Mormon patterns itself after the King James language. The primary reason for that, there's a lot of arguments around this, and I have my own personal opinion, which I don't mind sharing. One of the arguments is that, Joseph Smith, it was used because it was the one he was most common with. And I actually think that doesn't hold up at all, actually. I don't believe the translation process was hindered or limited by the translator and the translator's limitations, because the translator had all the limitations. He didn't know English very well. He didn't know the original language or the text. And he didn't have context for the writing. So if we're going to limit anything by the translator, everything should be different. However, Nephi tells us that he speaks to people according to their language, according to their understanding. And at that time, for a book of scripture to come out, in order for it to be heard, understood, and received, it would have had to sound like the Word of God, which was the King James translation. Right? Anything that violated that pattern too much just wouldn't even be received by Pratt or Young, right, or the early members of the church. And so, when you understand that the Book of Mormon is patterned with the King James process, or patterned with the King James just pattern and process, you start to think a little bit about this process that they use here. So the only way to designate the substitution in this text was the typesetters. If you think about it, the translators put the Lord, the typesetter had to put capital L-O-R-D to designate the substitution. Joseph, Oliver, and the typesetter for the Book of Mormon had no idea what they were doing in that context and had no concept of this at the time. And so when they went to go print it, they just printed the words that were translated very easily. If the typesetter had typeset it with a capital L-O-R-D, it would have more easily indicated that when we see the Lord in the Book of Mormon, it's a substitution for Jehovah, just as it is here. Pretty easy, right? Just a pretty easy assumption to be like, oh, when I see the Lord, it's just like the Lord here in the Old Testament, and it means Jehovah or Yahweh. The name Jehovah, right? Okay. Now, here's the implication of that. It's only clarity. It doesn't really change tons, but it makes some things clearer. When we read the Book of Mormon, particularly the LDS editions have this, have on the cover another testament of Jesus Christ. We know the end from the beginning, right? We're aware that Jesus is the principal figure. And so as we read it, we see Jesus through the whole text. Like, we just see him everywhere. You get to 1 Nephi 11 through 13, and we see Nephi's vision, and you're like, Jesus, 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 Jesus. Like, you just see him everywhere, right? Here's what's interesting. If you layer every time the words the Lord, and you replace that with Jehovah, the meaning of the names of Christ change. And I'll give you a for instance. From 1 Nephi chapter 1 through 2 Nephi chapter 5. And if you're interested to follow along, you can. 2 Nephi chapter 5 is probably the place we want to go. 2 Nephi 5. Okay. This is what we call the intentional record of Nephi. This is what Nephi intended to write. Right? This is a narrative of his exodus, and then eventually his exodus away from Laman and Lemuel. And then he's going to conclude chapter 5, and he's going to be done. So if you notice from chapter 6 on, the narrative no longer exists. It's almost like an entirely different pattern of writing. Okay? You get into some sermons, and then he teaches some doctrine at the end, but the narrative's done. Nephi, very clearly in verse 28, or 27 through 34, ends his record. And he ends his record in the same pattern that anyone who is ending the record ends it with. This is the quintessential, I'm done. He even starts with, in verse 28, and we lived after the manner of happiness. We lived happily ever after. Period. I'm done. Now for me to effectively close my writings, I just have to confirm to the reader the authenticity of where these writings came from. And now the last few verses is just that. All he's doing is reminding everybody he made the plates. And I'm just going to give a quick background on why this is true. I made some plates. I made some engravings. I was obedient to the Lord. I'm finishing up my record. I've engraved that which is pleasing unto God. And if my people are pleased with the things of God, they're going to be pleased with what I've written. And it suffices me to say that 40 years passed away, and we've already had wars with our brethren. Period. End of story. Done. Story done. Totally done. And then something happens in chapter 6 that makes him come back to the writing and make an appendix. But from chapter 1 to chapter 5 of 2 Nephi, the name Jesus Christ is never evoked. He's present in the prophecies, the messianic prophecies, but the name Christ or Jesus is never used. Only Jehovah or the Lord. That's interesting. And then in chapter 6, Nephi comes back to the record. Now, chapter 6 through chapter 10 are Jacob's sermon. Just a sermon inserted. Nephi, in essence, is saying, Jacob just gave this awesome talk, I'm going to slip it in. He just did something awesome, I'm going to slip it in. And in chapter 6, he starts to give a narrative. Chapter 7, he quotes Isaiah. Chapter 8, he quotes Isaiah. Chapter 9, we all know 2 Nephi 9 is beautiful, right? He evokes he teaches on the wisdom of the resurrection, the infinite atonement. He talks about the Holy One of Israel. And at the end of chapter 9, he concludes, kind of tired, he concludes in 54, and now, my brethren, I would speak unto you more, but on the morrow I'll declare the rest of my words. So he's just laid out the sermon. And then in chapter 10, starts the very next day with, wherefore, in verse 3, wherefore, as I said unto you, it must needs be expedient that Christ. Now, in all the record, Nephi, Lehi, and up to this point, Jacob, that is the very first time this name is evoked in the entire record. And then he clarifies and he says, for in the last night the angel spake unto me that this should be his name. Jacob pretty much says, last night I just found this out. His name is Christ. Now, in the idea that to understand his name gives power, dominion, or claim on him, this becomes a big deal. They're learning another part of God's identity, and they're getting claim on that. They're getting an additional name that gives them additional claim on God in a different personality, in a different covenant. And then the entire book of Nephi changes. He says, I just learned it's Christ, and to the people, they've just received greater access. They've received the ability to call upon Christ. And then what happens after that is Nephi goes into Isaiah to confirm that, to reinforce the Messiah's coming. And then in the last 6 chapters that he contributes to, Nephi evokes the name of Christ 55 times. He goes from never evoking it once to coming back and saying, okay, now Jacob just did something awesome, and now I've got to teach the gospel, the doctrine of Christ. Because they've just had revealed to them a new covenant and a new relationship they can have with Christ. One of mercy compared to that of Jehovah, which is justice. One of access to grace and new covenants. And so what takes place at that point, once you can identify the difference between the name the Lord and the use of the name Christ, the narrative as you go through the Book of Mormon changes between the Nephites and the Lamanites. It changes from just wicked and righteousness, cycles of wicked and righteousness, to cycles of, we'll say wickedness, for lack of better words, conversion to the law of Moses and being a good Israelite, and then evolution to being a Christian. So much so that Jacob is challenged by the Antichrist, not that he's not a good Israelite, but that he's converted Israel, the Israelite faith, into the belief of some being that they can't see. So what's challenged is that you've introduced a name and a covenant that has not been documented in our text, in our tradition. That's what Shem challenges Jacob with. Not that the law of Moses is wrong, but this new covenant has been added upon. And so what really gets interesting in this relationship is you start to understand now why people respond the way they do. In the King Benjamin example, we read King Benjamin very passively when in chapter 4 he's like, I'm going to give you guys a new name. And then he's like, it's Jesus Christ. And everyone's like, oh my goodness. And everyone goes crazy and they repent and they make a covenant. And for us, we're like, well, what do you mean? That's not new. to them, it was new. They had gone through an apostasy, a Nephite apostasy, in which Mosiah had to flee. They come to Zarahemla, they absorb into the Mulekites, and then they are brought to the Israelite faith through the plates of brass. And then after King Benjamin's reign, the next generation, they're given the covenant of Christ. And they react in the revelation of a new name because now they're given access to a different part of God's identity. And they're given the right to have claim upon his mercy, his grace, and his covenant. We read those in very passive sweeps, right? And we don't understand why they respond the way they do. When we roll into 3 Nephi 27, after Christ's ministry, he comes back to visit his 12 apostles. And they're debating on what to name the church. Now, all of us are like, duh, what are you going to name it? You're going to name it after Christ. But these apostles, they're debating, and his level of evoking and giving them permission to publicly name it after Christ is unprecedented. Because he's saying, give out my name. They had never considered that. They never considered making it as public and allowing people to have as much claim upon it as they would if it was publicly known. And so when you watch those, the narratives are actually really fascinating because you watch the missionary work change. Alma and Amulek, when they go and they minister to former Nephites, when they go to Alma 32 and those individuals and they're trying to rehabilitate former Nephites, they talk about Christ all the time. But the sons of Mosiah, who go into the Lamanites, never evoke the name of Christ in their ministry, ever. When they go to the Lamanites, they're talking about Great Spirit, the Lord, Jehovah. They're converting them to the Israelite faith first. And then they'll convert them to the Christian faith, to the name of Christ, because it is sacred. It's a separate covenant.
Milk and the meat.
Yeah, it's a separate covenant that they're making. So they first have to make a covenant with Jehovah, and then they can make a covenant with Christ. So it's really fascinating. Once you clearly identify, we associate the name the Lord with Jesus. Because as an individual, they're one and the same. But your name denotes that part of the identity that people can have claim on. So when God has made names, as we have those names revealed to us, we gain access to that. As we learn that his name is mercy, we then have faith that we can evoke mercy from him. Right? And what's interesting is in the book of Revelations, we learn that there's a name that no man knows. There's an element of his identity that's unrevealed, that will be revealed at the last time. It's really important. Revelations. There's a name of Christ, Jehovah, that person, that no one knows, that'll only be revealed at the last day. I'm just interested, I just wonder what it is. Just because that gives us, if we were to learn that, that gives us claim. So under the same framework, we have other narratives. The three Nephites. Mormon's like, I was going to write their names, and then I was told not to. Because they're going to be ministering around us. Under that same framework, if we knew their names, we would be able to have claim on them. We'd be able to evoke them, right, under that tradition. Right? So you have these moments when suddenly these nuances and names kind of shift and change around, and you're like, oh, now I understand why that's so important that they gotta keep that quiet. The fact that the brother of Jared's name is just the brother of Jared, that's interesting. But what's interesting on the revelation of Christ is when Moroni is condensing, we have the same pattern in Ether. When Moroni is condensing the record of Jared, here's what's, I'll just give this little commentary. Moroni sucks as a translator. He's terrible. As an abridger, his father is masterful. His father has studied these and has practiced this for decades. And as you go through the record, you realize that Mormon intended to be the one to abridge the record of the Jaredites, but he didn't have time, so he gave him to his son. And as you read the book of Ether, you realize son's not as good as dad. He's really scattered, right? He actually, his timelines, if you really pay attention, his timelines flip-flop. Like, he's really just trying to, like, hold this thing together. And then he takes the last, like, he takes, like, 4 chapters and is like, begot. I'm just trying to get through this. Begot. Right? That's something Mormon never did. Right? Mormon never get genealogies like that. And so you get this really, like, poor abridger, for lack of a better words, and I'll meet him one day and I'll apologize profusely for making fun of him like that, but that's even why, and I'll just caveat because I have to on this, in chapter 12 when he's like, I'm worried about how bad of a writer I am. And the Lord says, fools mock, but they shall mourn, right? Chapter 12, Moroni's almost done. He's like, I really haven't done this justice. And it's just important to be able to see that contrast. But in chapter 2, chapter 3 of Ether, this interplay between the brother of Jared and Jehovah is fascinating. Because the brother of Jared doesn't know what to do. He takes the lights up. He says, I know this, I knew this, I know this. He asks that the Lord touch him with his finger, right? And then it says this, it came to pass that when the brother of Jared had said these words, behold, the Lord stretched forth his hand and touched the stones one by one with his finger, and the veil, so touched the Lord, Jehovah, stretched this and touched them one by one with his finger, and the veil was taken off of the eyes of the brother of Jared, and he saw the finger of the Lord. Right? Side note, when you see the finger, it's the hand, right? He saw the finger of the Lord, and it was the finger of a man like unto flesh and blood. And the brother of Jared fell down before the Lord, and he was struck with fear. Now this is really interesting, right? Jared knows that he is built after the same image of God. Interesting. But something in that experience strikes him with fear, and he knows that he's flesh and blood. The rest of the chapter gives context and explains. He says, why hast thou fallen? And in 8, he said, I saw the finger of the Lord, and I feared lest you should smite me. Why? It's interesting. I knew not that the Lord had flesh and blood. Like, I knew we were created with the same image. You had 5 fingers, I had 5 fingers. Something in this, he keeps emphasizing blood. If you fast forward in verse 17, and now I, Moroni, said that I could not make a full account of these things which are written, where therefore suffice me that Jesus showed himself unto this man in the spirit, even after the same manner and the same likeness, even in the same body that he showed himself unto the Nephites. He showed himself under the same form as the Nephites, with prints and wounds in his hands. If Jehovah showed himself with wounds in his hands, the brother of Jared would see that as a weakness and would be absolutely terrified, because if you knew a deity's weakness, that deity would crush you, so you wouldn't reveal it. So he sees that Jehovah has scars. I knew we were in the same image, but I didn't think we were flesh and blood. And I'm terrified that you've recognized, I've seen that you can be scarred, hurt. And the Lord said unto him, because of thy faith, thou hast seen that I shall take upon me flesh and blood. And never has man come before me with such exceeding faith as thou hast. So that's the interesting thing. If it's not this, it's more than a normal experience, because many prophets have seen God and walked with him at this point. So something about this is never up to this point has this happened. But Enoch has walked with God. Has walked with God. So there's something about this that is more than that. And then the Lord goes through, and then in verse 14 he says, behold, I am he who is prepared from the foundation of the world to redeem my people. Behold, I am Jesus Christ. And then he reveals his name and his role and his covenant to the brother Jared. It's interesting because this is pre-Moses, right? So the function and use of names and understanding the interplay of the names of God in the Book of Mormon help create this narrative. A few things just as appendixes that I think are interesting and fun that we'll highlight kind of as we get close to wrapping some of this up are a few interesting things about names to kind of play into. One, meaning of names evolve over generations of time. That to me is kind of important. We all know that today when we say the word liberty, it means something different to us. It has an ironic tinge to it than it does to others, right? Names can change, names can evolve, meanings of names. For instance, in a really obscure and fairly inappropriate reference, the name Hitler denotes something very different now than it would have 100 years ago. The names, what happens in association with those names become associated with the name, and then the meanings change. Why I find that interesting is we learned the first time the word Mormon is evoked, it is evoked in the place where Alma goes and he hides. In the Book of Mosiah, he takes his church and he hides in the place of Mormon. And the reason he hides there is because it was named Mormon because it was infected with wild beasts. It was dangerous. It was ferocious. It was the only place you could hide and the king's men not really get to you. And so in Mosiah, in the abridgment, Mormon makes a point of saying a few things. He makes a point of saying the king called it Mormon because it was infested with wild beasts. Meaning, it had something to do with ferocity, danger, and wild animals. And then Mormon does something really interesting. Within that same chapter says, oh, but it took on a new meaning to the people who were there. How beautiful were the waters of Mormon. How beautiful. To the people who were baptized and converted there, the waters of Mormon, the land of Mormon. He reminds people how beautiful it was. The humorous part is that's his name. He's trying to highlight a little bit that at this point, the name has taken on a new meaning for people. It means something different. And to me, it means something different. And what's interesting is he's going to be called Mormon actually during an apostasy phase in the Nephite nation. And he is going to be a ferocious general. And just like the waters of Mormon, the things he does are also going to be beautiful and pleasant. And he's going to represent both sides of that name. And in one chapter of Mosiah, he's trying to help us understand that this name means two things to people. So, we're going to put a pin in those for just a minute. And I just want to walk through quickly the progression of names in the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon composes of three primary record sources. The small plates, the abridgment of Nephi, and then the record of the Jaredites. Okay. One general rule of languages is a language without text or a common text degrades over time. Right? But with texts, the language can be preserved. It can. So when the printing press came and could kind of solidify languages, books could be preserved, and the King James Version of the Bible is a great example. It became really well disseminated, and suddenly the evolution of English slowed down significantly. Evolution or degradation, right? One way or the other. It became easier to standardize and easier to replicate among a body of people. But without a common text, it changes from generation to generation to generation, and it degrades. Here's what's interesting about the names as you go through the Book of Mormon. What's interesting about the names, let's see if I've got, one day I'll have this on a larger thing. What's interesting about the names as you go through you don't have to read that, I'll explain it really quick. What's interesting about the names as you go through the Book of Mormon is on the small plates, all of the names are Hebrew, Arabic, or Egyptian. Right? Sherem, Enos, Jerem, Amaron, Chemish, Amalekite, and Onai. Every name is either an Egyptian, and pretty straightforward. It's either Egyptian, Hebrew, or Arabic. That's it. They're not evolutions or changes, they are. Now they have the plates of Nephi, and they have the brass plates, both of which are in an Egyptian script, and they can preserve their language. So for 400 years, give or take, they can keep their names pretty consistent. In fact, the interesting Chemish means 8, and their Chemish is actually the 8th generation from Lehi. It's a really interesting moment there. And then the small plates end, and the names shift entirely. What happens is a small group leaves the Nephites, and they take the plates with them, led by Mosiah. In fact, Mosiah is the only name on the small plates that comes at the very last chapter that is not either of those three. And Mosiah takes this small group, and he takes them over, and they meet with the Mulekites. Now, the Mulekites have been 400 years removed from Jerusalem, and they don't have a text, and they don't have the law, and now they interact. And the Mulekites are a larger population than the Nephites. It says the Nephites were very small in relation to the Mulekites. But they came and they taught them. Really interesting play happens here. At this point, all of the rest of the names through the Book of Mormon are now degraded Hebrew hybrid names. They have roots, but none of them are Hebrew anymore. They just have roots, which is exactly what you would expect after 400 years without a common text. So now you have names like Alma, Amulek, Mormon, Amarin, Amarian, Helaman, Ammon, Gadiad. They have common roots, but none of them are pure of anything anymore. Now they've intermingled and they've been really mixed up, including the name Mosiah. What's interesting is when you read Mosiah's introduction in the small plates, it's clear that he's writing this after Mosiah. He's like, I'm going to tell you about Mosiah, who just became king of these people. Mosiah is his king name. He's given the name Mosiah by the people. That's why it doesn't fit. He's given a name that's degraded and may have Hebrew roots, but isn't pure to any of the text anymore. And just like any common nomenclature, the larger group is going to absorb the smaller group. So that's why they're all kind of degraded from that point on. It's very clear that you have a whole different set of names from that point on that now interplay. Totally exactly what you would expect. And then when you get into the record of Jared, you have pre-Hebrew names. Uriah, Omner, Akish, Aha, Eth, Emer, Kohor. They don't follow Arabic, they don't follow Hebrew. It's an entirely different set. It's pre-Hebrew names. Shorter, they end in different vowels, so they have no association with them. There's three very distinct sets of names, and they all fit, and they all coincidentally fit within the narrative that it would be culturally. Mosiah to me is the most interesting one, because Mosiah comes in with a small band of Nephites. He brings the plates with him from an Exodus from the other one. And then this small band gets a king over the large band. It's very unusual. And then he's given the name Mosiah. What's fascinating is the closest Hebrew root name is Moshe. Moshe is Moses. And to them, Mosiah is a pattern of Moses. He has an exodus out. He carries the law with him. Interestingly enough, he carries with him all the artifacts that perfectly match what's in the Ark of the Covenant. He brings the liahona, which helps them find food and water. And in the Ark was the staff that helped them find food and water. He brings the sword of Laban, which raised in battle, guarantees victory. Moses' staff in the Ark, when it was raised, as long as it was raised, they won. As long as it was dropped. It's fascinating that everything that traveled on with them, there was a parallel in the Ark. So to the people of the Mulekites, he's a similitude of Moses. And so they make him King Mosiah, which is probably the closest 400-year-old degradation of Moshe that they recognize. Interestingly enough, you learn a little bit about Mulek. In the earliest time, Mulek is written in Oliver's hand. It's Molech, and then it gets crossed out, and it's written as Mulek. Molech so the story of Mulek is that somehow, for some reason, him and a group of people, he was a son of the king of Zedekiah, and him and a small group of people left and came over and formed the Mulekites, or, the land of Zarahemla. Okay? That's kind of all we know about it. What's interesting is if his name's not Mulek, but Molech, Molech was the god that Zedekiah worshipped, King Zedekiah, his father, and it was the god that he made sacrifices to. And if his name was Molech, it would indicate that as a small child, he would have been dedicated and consecrated to be sacrificed to Molech. So it's possible that his exodus was an effort to save him from being sacrificed out. So he would have been a child, because they sacrificed before 12. And so it's interesting interplay. Additionally, you start to understand why suddenly the kingmen in Alma start saying, like, we have rights to this. This kingman's like, we want a king, we have rights. We have a king, we want rights. Because in that framework, under the plates of brass would teach that the tribe of Judah has the rights to kingship. And Mulek was from the tribe of Judah. Those Jews coming out of Jerusalem would have been the tribe of Judah. And Mosiah was not of the tribe of Judah. And so their challenge to a kingship is one of heritage according to the law. So we think they have this huge, political, you're crazy, what are you thinking? In their mind, they're very much like, no, it is our right. They use it a lot. It's our right to have a king. Because we're the tribe of Judah. They view the kingship of the non-Jew, non-tribe of Judah as an affront to their Israelite faith. Right? That's one reason why King Benjamin tries to promote them above the Israelite faith into the name of Christ and the covenant of Christ. So the Book of Mormon is full of these learnings that we can get, right, from understanding their names and their framework. A final one that's intriguing to me is Lehi and the history of Lehi. Lehi is an Egyptian name. It's confusing to understand why Lehi is in Jerusalem. But because if he is a good tribe of Manasseh, if his grandfather was a good tribe of Manasseh, 100 years ago he would have been in the kingdom of Israel, which would have been up north, and would have eventually been scattered. So for some reason, his grandpa wasn't a good tribe of Manasseh guy. Well, but we know he's down there, and he's down there with an Egyptian name. Usually means that dad did a lot of business with Egypt. Did a lot of business with Egypt. Right? Lehi travels the Egyptian trade routes on his way out of town with his sons when they do the Exodus. He's very familiar with that. And then you have 3 different periods of his life and 3 different naming nomenclature activities with his children. He has, his oldest children are Laman and Lemuel, very Arabic names. Interestingly enough, Laman is evoked once in Jewish law, in Jewish scripture, and it's in reference to Solomon when they called him Laman because he's without God. Now, Lehi names him Laman, possibly denoting that at that period of life he was not an active Israelite. In fact, later on, you understand the urgency of him trying to rename what Laman means. He gets and he says, may Laman always, he names the river Laman and says, may Laman from now on always mean you continue to flow into the path of righteousness. He's anxiously trying to do what Mormon later does, which is add a new meaning to the name. A little bit of maybe regret for what he named him. And then you have a second set of names, which is Nephi and Sam, or Sam and Nephi, Sam's elder, right? Those are Egyptian. Sam's not short for Samuel, Sam is the name. And they're both Egyptian, which may indicate that that's where he built his wealth, is working in Egypt, on the Egyptian trade routes, up and down, from Jerusalem to Egypt, where he built his wealth. And then you have a second phase, the final phase, he names Jacob and Joseph in the wilderness, fully converted, patterned after the 2 of the most important names in the book, Plates of Brass. And so the story of Lehi might actually be one of, we'll say, a recent convert. One that is converted. And when you read the first few chapters, the first 5 or 6 chapters of First Nephi, you start to see, oh, he's learning as he reads the brass plates. He learns he's of the tribe of Manasseh. He is reading the brass plates and learning things that if he was maybe engaged his entire life, these wouldn't be new learnings for him. And so you see this, you see a really interesting change in Lehi and the things that he does, which we may be able to read into more or less because of the way he names his children and patterns them as such. And that's, I'll leave with that. And just a final thought. When we, under the ancient rules of having a covenant name, where we would be held responsible for anyone who evoked the covenant, to engage with them in that manner, it brings a lot more depth to the phrase taking upon ourselves the name of Christ. Because as we take upon ourselves the name of the covenant name of Christ, anyone who also has that covenant name, we would interact with them as if we made that covenant with them. And so anyone who would evoke the name of Christ or the covenant name or the contractual name to me, I am then obligated to respond to them as if I made that covenant with them. And so it's more than I take the name upon me and I'm going to do the things that I think Jesus would do. It's I'm going to respond to everyone with that covenant as if I made that covenant with them, as if they were Christ, as if they were the one I was covenanting with, because they've evoked that name to me, and that means something. And so understanding the function of names can also add more depth to what happens more sacred spaces. It can add more meaning to what we read in the scriptures and even how we interact with everybody with that level of respect. And I'll say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
What does Nephi mean?
Nephi, I have that, I don't remember. It's just Egyptian.
It's Egyptian.
I think it means more.
Some of the background that I read, the name, equates it with Memphis. So I'm wondering.
Memphis?
Memphis.
Yeah.
Nephi. And they associate what the reading I've done, I can't remember where it was now, with Nephi. So, but he was born, all of these kids were all born except for Jacob and
Joseph.
Joseph
They were both born in the wilderness.
in the wilderness.
I find it interesting that Jacob's the one that reveals Christ's name.
Yeah.
Jacob is the only of the three, Lehi, Nephi, and Jacob, that aren't influenced by Jerusalem. Like there's something interesting there that Jacob's the first one that can introduce that.
I believe he's probably.
Yep. And it's just an interesting, you read it's almost like you read the first 26 chapters of Nephi's writings up to 5, right? 27, you read up to 2 Nephi 5. And you almost have like an Old Testament, we were really obedient, we sacrificed, we gave praise. And then right after, Jacob's like, oh, here's the name of Christ. Nephi's like, baptism, grace, prayer, gift of the Holy Ghost. Like, it's like a New Testament reading all of a sudden. It's because they now have a different covenant to teach. And the contrast. We like to believe that prophets are the same the first day they're called to the last day they're called. And they're not. They grow and evolve. And once you put yourself in that moment, and you're like, oh, he thought he was done here. He thought he was done. And he's like, whoa, Jacob did something pretty awesome. Hold on for a minute. And he's like, almost in a rush. You feel almost at the end of 2 Nephi that he's in a rush to try to get these things down. And you just go.
I'm sorry, I'm going to step out.
Chemish was comes from which language?
Chemish is Hebrew for 8. And Chemish is an omnize. Chemish holds the plates for like a day and a half. He's like, I got these. I'm just passing them along, and he hands them off. But he's the 8th generation from Lehi. It's just interesting. From Lehi.
Off the top of your head, do you know how many years that is? I've noticed that the first handful of generations, there's a lot of years in between them. I don't know if you know off the top of your head how many years that had passed.
So probably about 300, because by the time you get to, you're at like 180 BC by the time you get to Mosiah.
It's like they're all older having kids still compared to our generations, you know?
Right. I'm surprised, like, you think of like Sariah and Lehi, like Jacob and Joseph. I don't know exactly how old Nephi was, but I don't think he was 8. Like, there seems to be like this, however old Nephi is, if we pretend he's 16, 17, 18, 14, 12, that's still a huge gap between those last two. And Jacob's young enough that after Nephi dies, he has a pretty decent ministry, and he continues to go. So, I mean, bless their hearts having kids later in life and in the wilderness.
What else did you do in the wilderness for 8 years?
There's no TV.
Yeah. You know, one thing I was thinking about when you were talking about how they didn't know really how to name the church in the Book of Mormon times.
Yeah.
It's the same thing in the Doctrine and Covenants. What are we going to call the name of the church? And then I thought about President Nelson's admonition to correctly call the name of the church.
Don't remove Christ from the name.
Yeah, and so it kind of made me think, I really should go home and analyze that more and think, what really is that covenant of saying the proper name of the church?
That's right.
Because I think that he's telling us something, and maybe I just wasn't paying attention enough.
Yeah, Elder Holland has a book called Christ in the New Covenant, and he pretty much explicitly is like, and I read it after I wrote the book, and I was like, oh, there it is. He's just like, Christ is the covenant. The name of Christ is the covenant.
Uh-huh.
And I was like, oh, there it is. All my research.
So is
I
that
spent
the
so
way-
much time. It's right there.
Is that-
Elder Holland said it, and I thought I had something special, and Christ was like, no, it's right there.
So are you thinking that that's what the book of Revelation is going to tell us?
I don't know. It's a name that no one knows, which means there's a part, what that would indicate, there's a part of his identity that we don't know.
Okay.
There's a name that we don't know. There's a part of him that he has not disclosed to us. And I don't know if that's wrath. I don't know. Like, I genuinely don't know. Because it says very specifically, like, he reveals that name in the acts of the last day.
Uh-huh.
That we're all going to be like, oh, I did not know that about you. And it's supposed to be something a little similar to that.
I think we know that he's going to be really upset with the wicked when he comes. I got that.
I got that. But he's been upset before. I mean, that's the other part.
Oh, yeah, he's brought out the borough many times.
Yeah, but I guess I'm thinking... when
Maybe
you're-
to a new level, right? Like,
Well, or you know what? I think I'm going to go on the positive.
oh, good for you.
For the ones that have believed and have been waiting for you to come and are looking forward to you coming.
Right. Like, it's a great day.
Yeah.
Great and terrible. Just great. For some of
Yeah.
us.
I would rather focus on the great. And
Thank you, Phil.
I want to be in that camp.
I gotta ask you, what did you say the meeting of Laban was?
Without God.
Without God.
That's
And
referencing Solomon's
Lehi-
time.
Solomon, they called Solomon's political foes call him layman when he rebels against God. And they say, we'll call him layman for he's without God.
And so the father names his son,
Layman.
okay, without God.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, my question as a father, would that be like, why would I name a child unless I know his destiny? Something like that would be like I'd name my firstborn Lucifer. And then down the road, I made a mistake and say, well, I gotta change the meaning of that name, correct?
Yep.
So I'm thinking, wow, why would he name him without God? Because all the time in there, he's trying to get him and his brother pointed in the right direction and follow this path, and he names him symbolic. That'd be like
It might
his
have-
son Lucifer.
Yeah, part of it is the idea that he, and I'm taking some wild assumptions, so everything here is going to be edited out after this, or before this. The assumptive narrative there is he was not an active Israelite. In fact, for him to be in Jerusalem and be named Lehi and give his kids Arabic names would be almost like, I'm just here for business.
Yes.
And I
I'm
know
just
that,
here. I'm just here for business. I'm here. I'm without God. I'm good. I'm just going to do my trade route. I'm going to make a lot of money. I'm now building my business in Egypt. I'm going to show my Egyptian professionals how Egyptian I am by naming my next two sons Nephi and Sam. Like, this is just business transactions. I'm naming my next kids
Gotcha.
Nephi and Sam, and then suddenly you get this moment where he's like,
Ouch.
God smacked me, and God told me, like,
Okay.
dude, there's going to be and so now he's on the streets telling people, you got to wake up. And then it does no reason, no wonder no one is listening to him.
Well, now I can't wait to read the book of Lehi because I want to know
Right.
his conversion story.
I know, right?
which is solidifies what you're saying, because you had the tribes, and for centuries you had the tribes, and they were spaced out. There was even locations given where they're going to be at, and Lehi had no idea which tribe he was from.
That's right.
That's just like bizarre. I guess
right.
that's one of the most
Oh, I found out I was
common
from
things.
Manasseh.
You know,
Yeah.
you're from this, and then the 10 tribes, and you bumped 2 tribes, and that was a big, I'm assuming, a big part of your identity was it what tribe you're from.
That's right. He had no, if he had no scriptures at home. Now, granted, it wasn't like it is where you could easily access them, but he had no record. He had no thought to take record with him until after he was told to go back and get them.
Right.
He had no reason to have them. Like, there's moments when you're like, oh, this prophet is a little bit more like me than a prophet. Right? Like, just the Lord's got moments of like, hey, wake up. And he woke up. And then it also gives reason why Laman and Lemuel are like, what is Dad doing? Like, this is different. In fact, 1 Nephi 19, you read Nephi's narrative, and he has one sentence in there that he's like, if the Lord didn't show me, I also would have died in Jerusalem. He's had this moment. He's confessing. He's like, if the Lord didn't show me what he showed me, I also would have stayed. And so this notion of like the Lord came, gave him the vision of the tree of life, and helped him through this process. And he's like, okay, because he also was, until he was told otherwise, he also was like, what are we doing? And he's got.
Didn't Nephi also have one of those moments, though, like Jacob, when Jacob found out the name of Christ? Didn't Nephi have that where he went, oh, and I just found out he's the Messiah? Isn't that
Well,
in Nephi too, where he didn't get that in family home evening? That was revealed to him.
Yep. So what is revealed to him is that Jehovah will be the Holy One of Israel, and that he will be crucified. But he's never told his name is Christ.
Right, but wasn't he referred to as Nephi refers to him as
As
Messiah?
Messiah. That's right.
Yeah, but not the Christ.
That's
yeah.
right.
So you can almost see the learning pattern of the whole family, how they a little bit here, a little bit here, a little bit.
And see, Lehi's challenge in Jerusalem isn't. He's not trying to convert the Jews to Judaism. He's trying to convert them to a messianic Israelite faith. He's trying to say a Messiah is coming, and everyone's like, no, it's not. No, it's not. No, it's not. And so he's just trying to. We forget that, right? They go through their own apostasy. They still have their traditions, their faith, their church, their temples, their rites of worship, but they lost the vision that there would be a redemption. And so what's revealed to Lehi is, no, there's this Messiah. So it's even 1 Nephi 1:1 is him trying to convince people it's a messianic faith. No, what we have is a messianic faith. There's prophecies. He's going to come. I've seen things. There's going to be a redemption. There's going to be something. And so Nephi gets that confirmation in his. Like, oh, I believe the messianic faith, right? And so it's interesting.
Can I share two things real quick? Almost like food for fact. You might know more on this, but you mentioned the D&C, the name of the church. And I read that when the church was given its name, that point was the only Christian church that bore the name of Jesus Christ. You know, Talmage or The Inevitable Apostasy, who wrote that book?
The Great Apostasy was Talmage, yeah.
Yeah, the other one, one was written called The Inevitable Apostasy. In the 70s, I forgot, I can tell you afterwards. But they'd written that the church, when it's given its name, was the only church that bore the name of Jesus Christ, as if God has preserved that for him. So this context makes that sound a little more profound, that name was, strictly, but the name itself carries a lot more implication. But also, too, here's a fun food for fact kind of thing for names, is when I read the Book of Mormon in its original form in a replica version, okay, all paragraph form. It was story form. It's really, really fascinating.
Changes the whole view.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I had a hard time knowing which Alma was which. It was Alma the younger, Alma the senior, Alma the younger. I thinking, where the heck is his name Alma the younger at? So I googled it. Which point does it go up Alma the younger? And Alma the younger, that names was given by modern scholars for us to differentiate who they are. I didn't know that. I'm looking for his name. Alma the younger
actually in there? Yeah.
Because I didn't know who. I could follow the story. Who was who? As clearly as we do now, I should say.
Because you're projecting onto it. You're like, oh, I'm expecting to see this here.
Yeah, and the name.
Expecting to see the younger written.
The name Alma the younger in this,
Right.
but it's not in there. There's just Almas. But in the chapter heading that we have now,
We say in the chapter heading.
yeah, it's given there as Alma the younger for us to differentiate. So when it comes to names, that was interesting for me to learn. Was there's no Alma the younger written in the scriptures. That was in the chapter heading for us to be able to know the story a little more clearly.
That's right.
So
And it's interesting, you get to Alma chapter 5, when Helam in chapter 5, as you were talking, Lehi and Nephi, Helaman in chapter 5 is pretty explicit. I gave you these names, like I named you, so now we have given names for these very, like, you have to remember this. And you just get these weird interplays. Anyways, there's so many, like, we could spend a lot of time in nuances and names, but
Yeah.
we don't.
Isaiah naming his kids, that's kind of
Yeah.
interesting.
Terrible names.
Well,
Terrible. Mahala, Hashbaz, Shahazbaz.
Yeah. An example of given names in the
That's right.
scriptures.
The Lord will destroy you, pretty much.
Did you see President Nelson's October Leahona of his article? He was the introduction article. It was on the everlasting covenant, and he talks about the word Hesed, H-E-S-E-D. So that was just here, and so he goes back, and then that's on footnote 3, and then he goes to that book of God Will Prevail by Carrie Milstein. But it's Hesed talks about the covenantal relationship between the person and God, or between people who have all made that same covenant. So you were saying something at the end of
Right.
some part there about that covenantal
Right.
relationship.
That William Prop quote too, where William Prop says there's that tradition that on the staff of Moses was another name that wasn't Yahweh, that was not revealed. I just personally just keep thinking about that being Christ. Like that just not being shared or revealed, and just curious as to one day I'll find that staff. I'll let you guys know.
Here we go. They will have